Hello, welcome to the VCUarts faculty lecture series. My name is Roy McKelvey. I'm chair of the graphic design department here in Richmond, and I'm honored to introduce my colleagues from VCUarts Qatar. Our panelists for today, first is Astrid Kensinger, associate professor and chair of graphic design at VCUQ. Astrid Kensinger has pursued her art and design practice internationally, spending much time in Japan, Singapore, Australia, and the US. She uses her craft to inform her multidisciplinary research collaborations. Astrid interweaves information visualization, cartographic performance, and performance art with graphic design to virtually articulate site-specific narratives, intangible heritage, contemporary issues, and the map as art. She has exhibited and presented her work internationally in solo and group shows, juried exhibitions, and conferences. Her most recent multidisciplinary research collaborations have included facilitating through co-design, dengue fever outbreak solutions, and visualizing the research methodologies of linguists, mapping and preserving endangered languages in the Southeast. Astrid is an associate professor and chair of graphic design at VCUQ. Our second panelist is Maysaa Al-Mumin. Maysaa is trained as an architect and a Kuwaiti associate professor in art and design at Virginia Commonwealth University of Arts in Qatar. She is also a filmmaker, recently named an Arab Star of Tomorrow by Screen International. In architecture, she has completed several residential products in the UK, Kuwait, Kosovo, and Bahrain, and was a participant in the Kuwait Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2014 under the curation of Aliyah Farid. As a filmmaker, she has focused her films on women's experiences in the Middle East, particularly on production design and the role of innovation in the narrative. Her short films were screened at several respected international film festivals, such as Tampere Film Festival, Cairo International Film Festival, Nashville Film Festival, and Moscow. So please welcome Astrid and Maysaa.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Roy. Thank you so much. Good evening from Doha. I think it's noon in the States right now. Roy, thank you so much for the introduction. So we're going to launch right in. We have about a 45-minute presentation or so, and at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. Thank you for this opportunity to share the VCUarts Institute for Creative Research Intangible Lab and the Mapping Migration Memories Research Grant. We're really grateful for your time tonight or today, and we're looking forward to introducing our lab's vision, our current research grant, and our plans for the immediate future. We welcome questions at the end of the talk. To begin, this is something that I learned in Australia, and we like to apply now to our time in Qatar. We begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we will be discussing today, and pay our respects to their elders and present, past and present. We extend that respect to the Al-Naimi and the Al-Mari people who may be with us today. So I'm going to be sharing our screen. So we want to start the talk today with a bit of our backgrounds to give context to our current research project and lab. So I'm Astrid Kensinger.
And I'm Maysaa Al-Mumin.
I'll start off a bit. My name is Astrid Kensinger, as you've heard. And for those of you that I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting, I'm the chair, as you just heard, of graphic design here at Virginia Commonwealth School of the Arts in Qatar. So I'm originally from San Francisco, but most of my industry, practice, and teaching have been outside of the States, primarily in Asia, Europe, Australia, and the Gulf. This global exposure and consistent exploration of culture and identity have shaped my teaching and practice significantly. I have an undergraduate degree in classical and Near Eastern archaeology from Bryn Mawr and an MFA in graphic design from RISD, where I researched live art, participatory art, the archaeology of festivity through the lens of graphic design. And you might find that this stretch from the archaic artifact in archaeology to living history and live participation may seem huge, but what we hope today to reveal is how that strata and co-layering and lines can be manifest and extend into the future through art and design. So my work involves projects that are site-specific, with layers of history that allow for co-presence, reenactment, and often a pedestrian participation with history. So this goes from pilgrimages to sacred mountains to mythological and archaeological sites. Because I've been nomadic for so long, and because of this background in archaeology, as well as over a decade in Japan, I tend to think a lot about location as well as time well spent, marked, ritualized, celebratory, slow, endured, deep, and mapped. So my personal narrative often interweaves with the site-specific, sinking time and location into multi-layered, multi-strata meta-narratives. So over the last 2 decades, my research has been mainly in mapping, GPS trace art, 2D, 3D visualizations of maps and motion, with multiple international exhibitions as outcomes. But the focus has been consistently to question how maps emerge as a relation between the site-specific, historical, and cultural contexts and my own embodied presence in a location.
So my academic and creative practice straddles design and film. I was born in Kuwait, lived in London and Qatar, but also have called Finland my home. I have both undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in architecture from the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, and I have completed a number of residential cultural projects in London, Italy, Kuwait, and Bahrain before moving into academia and more recently film. In past conversations with Astrid, she often mentions how she uses her body as an instrument to read and reflect on a physical environment from a phenomenological sense. And it resonated with me that in parallel, performing for the camera for a number of films over the years, essentially a reenactment of another kind, has allowed me to read a rather complex context and multi-tethered representation of women over a large span of, albeit fictitious, space and time. With a strong interest in amplifying self-reflections of Arab women, I wanted to be certain that the way I addressed these in film was easily extendable and accessible to a universal and inclusive audience, but at the same time, true, uncompromising, and deeply personal. I'd like to invite you to consider that only 12 years before I was born, Kuwait gained its independence. And gas was discovered in Qatar in the early 70s, meaning that the astronomical speed that changed the Gulf region drew local population into an immediate shift to so-called modernity, creating a schism between the old and the new modes of generational interaction. Allow me to illustrate this point. So on the left at the top is a photo of my great-grandfather, my 2 grandfathers, and their half-brother on the right. Though the bottom 3 photos were taken in the 60s, photos like these are extremely rare. In fact, my family only stumbled on one of those photos on the left a couple of months ago. So before that, I had no idea what one of my grandfathers looked like. So this is also my grandmother, Rahma, and though these captured photos, through these captured photos, I know what they look like, but it's through my grandmother's stories that I know that they traveled every year across Arabia with stops in the Sharqiya, which is close to Qatar, Kuwait, Basra in Iraq, Abadan in Iran, all along gathering pilgrims for the long journey to Mecca for Hajj. And it's through her stories that I knew that the appearance of the Suhail star signaled the welcome relief from the hot summers. and that the long journey could be riddled with risk of disease, but to be covered from head to toe in henna would reduce the fever. I knew that she hated it, and she cried for missing her mother and her sisters along the long journey. In the absence of tangible evidence, such as these photographs or objects, oral stories are all that I have to know about my own recent history.
So while the earlier works that I shared are my lab experiments, they inform my collaborative and multidisciplinary research as well. In Singapore, where I lived for about a decade or a bit over, I was part of a research cluster, DIHA. It's the Digital Intangible Heritage of Southeast Asia, working very closely with a team of linguists who were actively documenting endangered languages. And my role really was to be mapping their research process. It was through this work with linguists that I became more aware of the link between language, cultural narrative, identity through the map. So working closely with these linguists who were active on site, gathering and recording endangered languages, one of the techniques employed was to go on walks to gather stories of territory, identifying sites of memory, paths of community narrative, and layers of collective memory. The act of walking revealed specific words and local ecological knowledge that defined community and differentiated one language from the next. Language evolution and walking go hand in hand. So in fact, we could say that it's through the pedestrian experience that language is formed. What we see as we move requires identification. So archaeolinguists are often able to identify the oldest layers of a language as those words that identify geographic sites like caves, water sources, bays, and mountains. But language also evolves through the pedestrian experience of identifying local flora and fauna. The walk from site to site leads to words and stories that do not reveal themselves if we're sitting inside or staying in one location. And I mention this right now because towards the end of today's talk, we'll be sharing a bit of a preview as to our next research projects.
We are particularly invested in learning from the past and co-layering current, local, and inclusive narratives that can be exhibited or extended through participatory engagement. This brings us to now and our current research project here in Qatar, the Intangible Lab Mapping Migration Memories. Intangible heritage has often been described as a critical force behind cultural diversity. Article 2 of the 2003 UNESCO Convention for Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage describes intangible cultural heritage as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, and skills handed down from generation to generation. This knowledge is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interactions with nature, and their history, and provides communities with a sense of identity and continuity, promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity.
So the Intangible Lab's aim is to capture and physically translate the vibrantly diverse intangible cultural heritage within Qatar through interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary lenses. This research cluster, it's a research and design cluster, brings together designers, artists, cultural scholars, scientists, and museum curators from partner universities in Education City here in Qatar in the multiversity spirit, as well as incredible external collaborators and consultants, as well as we're looking for some collaborators from the Richmond campuses. We're particularly interested in identifying traditional, local, and ecological wisdom that can contribute to supporting sustainable energy and environments and in optimizing health for a just and equitable society. So the Intangible Lab right now is currently comprised of myself as the PI and co-PI Associate Professor Maysaa Al-Mumin, a filmmaker, as you heard, recently named as an Arab Star of Tomorrow by Screen International. We have Dr. Aspa and Raviv Cohen, who serve as our desert ecologists and desert ecosystem experts and are consultants to the lab. Ala, our postgraduate research fellow, has been essential in filming, interviewing, editing, and designing for the lab. And we have Guillaume, a French Qatar-based sound artist who is our sound consultant and our deep listener. Nishi Raffles runs the administrative side of the lab, and we can't live without her, actually. Alanud Althani is our undergraduate lab designer. And we're also incredibly happy to share that Qatar archaeologist Shaima Sharif of Embrace Doha has just joined the lab this year and will be working closely on upcoming projects.
We are particularly inspired by the call in the foreword of Gulf Women from Her Highness Sheikh Moza to make Qatari memories, particularly those of women, visible, to break the silence and critically assess the archives of history for the construction of an inclusive future. In this regard, we have collectively decided to focus our gaze and, where possible, seek out memories specifically from mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and great aunts, and women in the community.
So how did this start? I only arrived in Qatar in December of 2020, so I'm relatively new here. The first thing I did was go to the National Museum, and I was especially inspired by one of the oral history sections that features Qatari elders speaking of their memories of a biannual migration from the sea into the desert and back. So this mass movement of people in sync with the turning of the planet and the shifting of the seasons, very much like the lungs of a country moving in and out twice a year, in and then once out, like a tidal movement of motion, is the inspiration for the Intangible Lab's first project. Mapping Migration Memories is a multi-year research project that's gathering existing archived recorded memories and photo or film documentation and is seeking out unrecorded memories of the biannual Qatari migration. We're looking at the walk itself, not the sea and not the camps in the desert per se, but the actual paths taken. In early 2022, after being awarded funding for this initial research project, I put a call out for student research assistants, and the names you see here, I was able to create a team with these three who continue with the lab now and last semester, and two who actually co-led our expeditions, which we're about to talk about, into the desert.
So this project began before the formation of the lab and became the first project of the lab. In the beginning, the research team worked closely with the help of Dr. Williams of the VCU Library and in search for references and materials relating to the migrations. We began to build our literature and contextual reviews. At that time, we planned on holding focus groups, and we collectively did our CITI training and applied for an IRB. The goal at that time was to source, collect, translate, transcribe, and visualize migration memories from VCUarts Qatar families into physical maps and illustrated books of memory. We had many questions, and during this time, the team co-created a bilingual questionnaire to be shared with VCU Qatari families.
In April, we were awarded funding for the Intangible Lab. We immediately set up our lab space with a huge map of Qatar covered in sand, which we use in our meetings as we talk and paint paths and in all of our discussions, and which we also hope to use in the focus groups. So VCUarts Qatar at this time created the Institute for Creative Research. And some of the labs within the school were asked to present to the Qatar Foundation and the VCU research leadership. At this presentation, we had two gifts come to us. We were advised by the Qatar Foundation leadership to immediately reach out to the Qatar National Library Heritage Section, and Raviv Cohen, who is our desert tracker within the lab, who was filming the event that day, very generously introduced us to Dr. Aspa. 2 days after the Research Institute presentation, the lab was gifted with the time and attendance of all of the Qatar National Library leadership, where we were able to present the grant, the lab's vision, and the research assistants were immediately given a shelf of their own in the Heritage Reading Room, where they began to source and collect books. All summer, the Mapping Migration Memory researchers were busy making connections and excavating for traces of documentation of the migrations, which are very few and far between.
After the summer of researching with the help of the National Library's Heritage Section, we settled on 2 books in particular, The Danish Expedition from 1959 and a unique book of female Bedouin poetry. While we waited for the IRB to be approved, we recognized that we needed to act. And with the extraordinary findings we discovered from the Danish expedition, we decided to focus on what was amazingly and by pure chance we had within the lab.
So if you are not familiar with the Danish expedition, in 1959, 2 Danes, Jetty Bang and Klaus Ferdinand, came to Qatar and lived with and documented 2 families in Qatar, the Al-Naimi and the Al-Mari. They came at a time of great change when the young men, particularly the Al-Naimi family, were shifting to work and schools and away from the nomadic life. Both Jetty Bang and Klaus Ferdinand were directly connected to the Danish archaeologists who were already working in Qatar. And both of them were granted permission and then welcomed with great generosity and hospitality by the Al-Naimi and the Al-Mari families to move with, live with, and document both of the families for 3 months. So the photos of Jetty Bang and then the findings of Klaus Ferdinand were later published in the book that you just saw, as well as a much more extensive written book. This other one is more of a photo book, the extensive one called Bedouins of Qatar in 1993. And a short color film was also compiled by Jetty Bang called Bedouins in 1962. Oh, sorry.
When we made the connection that the Danish expedition from 1959 focused on the Al-Naimi and Al-Marri, and that this is our research assistants Sarah and Maha's family, we unanimously decided to hold our own expeditions and visit the sites of the Al-Naimi and the Al-Marri as a reenactment of co-presence for both Sarah and Maha to step into the footsteps of their great grandparents and co-layer with time into the paths of their own families. These expeditions were performed in the seasonal time of the actual winter migrations.
So on October 21st and 22nd of 2022, right before FIFA, and with the great help of Dr. Aspa and the entire lab, and with our film permits from the Ministries of Culture and the Ministry of Municipality and the Danish expedition book in hand, we headed south to the Al-Mari lands and paths of Karana. We had 1 day to get to know the site and learn about the desert ecosystem specific to the location, and to determine our course of action for filming and recording Maha on site.
Maha and the full team then worked together on the 22nd with audio recorders on her wrists and feet to absorb the sound of the walk, and with the film crew directing and shooting as Maha stepped into the footsteps of her Al-Mari ancestors.
And we're about to see and share a short clip of the Al-Mari expedition. It's a work in progress, but we'd love to have you listen carefully, if possible, to the sounds of the south and of Maha's walk, and to keep that in mind when we later shift to the north.
Today is October 22. We're shooting the mapping migration memories for the Almari path. Okay, it's Maha Almari.
On October 28th and 29th of 2022, again with our film permits from the Ministries of Culture and Municipality and the Danish expedition book in hand, we headed north to the Al-Naimi Pass in Marwab. We again had one day to get to know the site and learn about the desert ecosystem specific to the location and to determine our course of action for filming and recording Sara on site.
So Sarah and the full team then worked together on the 29th, again with audio recorders on Sarah's wrists and her feet to absorb the sound of her walk, and with the film crew directing and shooting as Sarah stepped into the footsteps of her Al-Naimi ancestors. You're about to hear Sarah on the Al-Naimi path, an area much to the north with a very different soundscape and ecosystem.
Sara Naimi, mapping migration, Al-Naimi path.
Action!
29 October.
The entire lab is now in full edit mode. We are sculpting together the audio and films for two outcomes. One, a behind-the-scenes documentation of the entire lab process, including the expeditions, and the other is an evocative, poetic, and immersive installation for exhibition this April.
So how does mapping migration memories fit within social sustainability? Historically, the Qatari relationship to land use was seasonal and climate-based. This research and reenactment hopes to inspire, extend, and also celebrate memories of Indigenous wisdom and traditional knowledge through embodied knowledge. Indigenous communities have devised distinctive methods of encoding useful data within philosophies of thought and modes of activity that are linked to particular landscapes. This data includes geographical, genealogical, biological, and other evidence that maps human relations to flora and fauna, land and water, and supernatural forces. The general public's interest in understanding Qatar's nomadic history was abundantly clear in the recent On the Move exhibition a show at the Qatar National Museum that highlighted nomads from Mongolia, North Africa, and Qatar, and was one of the star shows during the FIFA season last fall. And this leads to one of the goals of this project, which is to have the opportunity to pitch to the relevant stakeholders a well-designed proposal for a permanent pedestrian path to be created that serves as a poetic and participatory living history pathway, a Qatari pilgrimage, if you will, preserving and extending this annual tradition through slow tourism, which in turn will promote health and cultural sustainability. We're aiming to have the pitch ready by April, in sync with our exhibition of the expeditions and the reenactments. And for this, I'm working very closely with Dr. Aspa. The other goal of the lab is to actively cultivate a rapidly growing interest within the graphic design department in sourcing and drawing from intangible cultural heritage, and to use art and design to extend, revisit, and reinvent intangible cultural heritage for the future through tangible outcomes. With this in mind, I'm actually leading a new elective this semester. It's called the Edible Lab, Food, Culture, and Design, where students are exploring food and local customs, drawing from their own kitchens and current practices as well, while also sharing and eating together, actively engaging in collective memory sharing. This image was just from last week in Souk Waqif here in Doha, where Embrace Doha and Shaima Sharif led our class through a food tour of the souk. The Edible Lab is leading up to one of the second projects, or the second project for our lab. So the lab's second project flows directly from the first, moving from mapping and reenacting the path of migration to identifying desert food. In the hunt for the desert truffle, we hope to reveal ecological knowledges that will locate resources and observations of the interactions between living beings and natural processes within the Qatar ecosystem that ensured human survival. The hunt for the desert truffle has potential to contribute to the current and future environmental sustainability goals of Qatar through traditional ecological wisdom. So archaeologists have found mention of the desert truffles in cuneiform clay tablets unearthed at an excavation of a 4,000-year-old Amorite site in eastern Syria. The 14th century explorer Ibn Battuta records having seen them in abundance in the Sahara Desert. Some people see them as a potential crop that could thrive in a changing climate globally. For others, the desert truffle holds culinary intrigue. Cultivating desert truffles remains a challenge, and many scientific papers lament the lack of basic knowledge of their biology at all levels. In the hunt for the desert truffle, we hope to gather stories, myths, legends, facts, recipes, and foraging skills from grandmothers, and also work with climate scientists and nutritionalists. And this brings me back to the introduction of today's talk and my earlier work with linguists in Southeast Asia. Language. In the event of cultural obsolescence, language is one of the most perishable links to our heritage, and the loss is often gradual and insidious. This often takes place without any visible or concrete traces within the community. Currently, there's an increased awareness of the crucial role language plays in binding such intangible cultural heritage together. Despite the critical role played by intangible aspects in conserving and preserving our heritage, documenting it and displaying it in a form that's accessible and engaging still remains a challenge for researchers and museum curators. And this is where our lab will have tangible impact. The hunt for the desert truffle will focus on identifying words and language of the desert. It is deeply inspired by both of the books here and particularly this book, Lost Words. This book is a book of English words from the UK that have dropped out of children's dictionaries over the last few decades because of an increasing lack of engagement with the natural environment. So this is an overview of some of the projects that are coming up, an overview of where we're at right now, the process of getting to where we're at. We have some dissemination from 2022, some more coming up this year. One of the big ones that we're very excited about is our abstract was peer-reviewed and accepted into the Prague's Heritage Past and Present Built and Social Conference. And yeah, that's where we are. I would like to leave you with this particular quote. It's a wonderful quote. I don't normally read quotes from screen, but this one I really love and I read. The past, in short, does not tail off like a succession of dots left ever further behind. Such a tale is but the ghost of history, retrospectively reconstructed as a sequence of unique events. In reality, the past is with us as we press into the future. In this pressure lies the work of memory, the guiding hand of a consciousness that, as it goes along, also remembers the way. Retracing the lines of past lives is the way we proceed along our own. Before we break for question and answer time, there is a QR code right here that you can, if you have your phones, you can access. It's the film we made at the very beginning.
Setting out our intentions, actually.
Yeah, it was right at the beginning of the semester. So we did it kind of towards the end of summer, launching way before the expeditions.
That's right.
Even before knowing about the Danish expedition. So, but please have a view, a peek, and I'll stop sharing my screen right now. Hi.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. What amazing journeys you're on in many ways. Yeah, so I neglected at the beginning, I apologize, to ask people to post questions in the chat so that we could kind of kickstart the Q&A. So if you have questions, please add them and I will make sure to address them. So to get things started, I have a few questions I jotted down. So one thing I was curious about, and actually the quote you just posted kind of gets at this, which is you're looking at the past, you're looking at indigenous wisdom, you're looking at culture that is kind of being lost. But I was curious, I was thinking of like the idea of navigation through deserts, shifting sands, those kinds of ideas. And it made me think of something I mentioned to you before we started today, which is the shifting sands of Doha itself, and the culture, the tremendous pressures on culture that's happening currently. And I was just curious about, how do you, the idea that you're looking at heritage that is in the past and trying to resuscitate it in some ways. But, heritage is an ongoing process. So I'm just curious what the lessons are in a way by looking at the past for the things that are happening day to day in Doha.
Oh, that's a great question, and
That's right.
complex too. So
Yes.
a couple of our students, the ones that we went on the expeditions with are actually, they are of the two paths that they were reenacting.
Mhm.
And I think they were asked questions at a recent presentation about nostalgia as well.
Yeah.
Like how nostalgia impacted their experience of the site and the site specific. And a couple of them one felt a genuine nostalgia, another felt like a more of an urgency to not just preserve. So I think that's where we're hoping our lab has impact. It's not about the preservation in a kind of archival, put it into a shelf and save it for later. It's more of an attempt to, it's living history,
Yeah.
right? So it's living history. It is alive still. The threads are still there, though they are
Yes.
quieting down.
And I think also we have to be, there is a little bit of tension of, we're talking about, I don't think it's about reviving a heritage. I think it is actually just drawing on from that knowledge, a knowledge that's disappearing, a knowledge that can still be useful now, and, giving it, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, in terms of generational communication, there's a big gap there. And so I think that there's, and I think this is where the tension lies, is that there's a struggle now with generations. I think in anywhere around the world, that kind of change between one generation to another goes over about 4 generations, maybe. And here it is happening, within people's lifetimes. So that's, that's where the struggle happens. And, like Astrid was saying, that there's, this ecological knowledge that's completely being lost, even though our landscape is still there. It's
Although shifting and changing as
shifting
well.
and changing, but there's, yeah.
Right. And shifting and changing because of climate change here as well. So, right. So it's shifting and changing because of modernization, but also when you go out into the desert, it's climate change and maybe even engaging in the desert. We step on, and Dr. Aspa might be in the audience, we step improperly on the ecosystem, which is quite fragile but tenacious, right? And yeah.
Well, glad
And
to see you.
that's an area that I'm interested in for the next project, right? Is finding a way to really preserve the words of the desert. So we're hoping to do a series of books. It would be Words of the Desert, Words of the Sea, Words of the Sky. There'll be multilingual publications.
Well, let me, there are a number of interesting questions have surfaced, so that's great. So let me just address those. So they're in the chat for your reference, but Basma Hamdi from VCUQ. I'm curious how you see the connection between language conservation and preservation and mapping migrations, but also the journey through time. Yeah, I had thought of that too. Why is it important to preserve language if it's evolving? And what is the significance of tradition's connection to language?
Good question. I mean, I find language is, the formation of language is related to the pedestrian experience to start off with. And it's directly linked to the local, under the foot, local knowledge of the flora and fauna of where you are stepping. And if you are no longer stepping, that's where some words become quite endangered. Like if you're staying out of that pedestrian experience and staying only within a new, like air-conditioned environment, words that are specific to a particular ecosystem that have been maybe developed over millennia and in recognition of understanding of that ecosystem are very unique, and in them contain a vast amount of a repository of, thousands of years of ecological understanding. When those words are no longer being used because people aren't walking, there's a huge danger of loss of knowledge that is ecological knowledge, right? And so languages evolve, of course, but there's a wisdom in the ecological knowledge of language of the site specific.
Great, thank you. Kelly Lawler asks, is there a healing component with this too, also acknowledging the value it has to heal? This seems huge from my perspective.
Yes.
To heal.
Well, I mean, I would say yes, because just judging from the experiences of our students, and I think that we as a collective going out on this journey, we've all felt yeah, I mean, through understanding, the respect for the land, but then hearing the stories, even the students on our journey talking about their grandmother's stories, and we felt that we had like a shared experience, which I think in our modern day way of like just of living that our students may have lost to a sense. I think they've have a revived interest in the personal stories of both their grandparents, but also, to the land that they live in, so, or we live in, so.
Great, thanks. The next question is about mapping, and actually I had some thoughts about this also. Sarah Reed asks, are you creating maps as you go through the work as tools for understanding and processing, or more so as documents to capture outcomes and observations? And I'll just add to that what I was going to ask also about, if you're literally making maps, the question of accuracy, are you thinking of maps metaphorically? Are they literally maps of the deserts? Graphic designers, we tend to think about maps in abstraction. So if you are making maps.
No, we will be making maps, and we've had to, as research is and as research goes, and you need to navigate on your own path and map as you're moving along. So originally in our path, our goal and our agenda was that we were having focus groups and bringing in memories, and that those memories would lead us to trying fragments, I guess, of shared stories where we could rebuild poetic and evocative atlases of memory, if you will, mixed with oral histories, because
it's more about nodes and connections as opposed to geography.
Nodes and connections was the title of my last talk. Yes. Nodes, it was nodes, connections, and limits, actually. Yeah. Yes, it's nodes and connections. At that stage it was, there's not that much written history here in Qatar that comes, older history. A lot of it was from the outside, with the colonial gaze as well. And so a lot of the history is only oral history when it comes to things like this. There are no maps of the paths that people took into the desert, but there's collective memory that is fragmenting as the generations move along. So I would say poetic. And yet, if you look at a map of Qatar, where the highways are and where, like major streams of traffic are, as in any country, these are indicators of older paths that were pre-highway and pre-modernization, right? So the traces are there. They're there. If you look at the map, that's what that previous path was. But to the exact specificity, we have a lot of questions. There are a lot of different families. Did they all move in the same way? No. And so, right, it's a collective kind of shared atlas of memory, hopefully, out of the focus groups with the IRB later. But this one is a reenactment of paths that we stepped into a path, right, that existed. And yeah.
Okay, I'm going to keep this moving. There's lots of great questions. Sorry if I mispronounce the name. Rana Kazkaz.
Hi, Rana. Hi, Rana.
I'm struck by how often we focus on image and sound in considering the past and history, and yet you encourage a deeper sensorial experience with taste and smell added through cuisine. I wonder how touch, feeling, and other sensorial considerations might be further considered.
Yeah, to have a fully phenomenological experience when we create the exhibition as an immersive space is something that we're really considering. Thank you for bringing that up. We are the space that we're creating it's spatial. There will be sound that you kind of get immersed into of footsteps in the desert, and you have to navigate through it. So you are actually engaged in a path of your own. But we've been wondering about how to bring in smell and taste. Yeah, we're going on a desert expedition. Sorry, this Thursday. Shaima Sharif and Dr. Aspa, who's here, I think, is taking us out the edible lab to the desert to forage for food. So hopefully we'll have some taste that we can bring in, Ramana.
So those two at the moment stand as, follow-on projects, but, there's, there are longer-term goals where maybe those things can come together. And, in terms of form, the act of mapping, can take many forms. And I think smell and taste definitely can be incorporated in that.
Mm.
So Sarah Fahim asks, do you feel heritage in general? I'm sorry, you referred to the desert as fragile yet tenacious. Do you feel that heritage in general is also fragile yet tenacious?
The desert is, because of how we've been treating it.
Yeah. What about heritage?
Heritage is always on the move. It's the living force that's constantly changing and evolving.
It's inherently so. It has to.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
otherwise,
living.
otherwise we're standing still, and that's not the intention of this.
Yeah, we don't want to snapshot and trap at all. We're trying to find ways to work with intangible cultural heritage. So it's not just preserved and archived, but where, especially with the design students and, in the lab, looking for ways where the students can take from intangible cultural heritage to recreate, repurpose, reinvent, and push forward. Yeah.
When you think of it, if I was to draw similarities between the way we've approached architecture in the region, I can speak for there's something very similar happening here in Qatar, but in Kuwait, with the onset of the discovery of oil and modernity, and we wanted to modernize. So we kind of the way we did it was very different to Qatar in that we obliterated the urban fabric and then just superimposed a new master plan from scratch, and then 50 years later, in the 90s and early 2000s, we decided that was too old, and we're gonna knock all of that down in favor for new urban structures. And that's not what I'm saying that happened here architecturally, or because there's still some traces of Doha, but there is, I think, with again this very quick and sudden change in kind of timeline, in terms of timeline, I think there is a local fear of everything moving on, and it is a real threat, and that is why it's an integral part of the 2030 vision for Qatar. Is one of the aspects is to try to retain or maintain a respect for tradition and culture and heritage as well. So
I think we only have time for maybe one or two more questions. So it's great. There's so many people chiming in. So forgive me if I don't choose your question. Maybe Catalina Hernandez, how would you imagine a kinesthetic mapping in the sense you mentioned of the experience? I was wondering when you were talking whether the mapping was actually embodied in the narratives and in the videos. Is that a form of mapping, or so the idea of kinesthetics of I guess video, or maybe it would even be motion graphics if it were something more in the graphic design realm.
Well, we have Ava, who's actually going into AR VR with some of the maps for us. Yeah. So we're trying to.
He's right there in the audience. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Ella. Yeah. That's one direction that we're looking at. The maps at the moment, and we have 2D visions of some of the maps that we're planning. We have sculptural visions of some of the maps that we're planning. We have
the audio connection.
Audio is
based, and
so if we're talking about the audio, right? What Guillaume set up, with the Sarah and Maha became instruments for absorbing the sound as they walked. So they had microphones strapped to their ankles and to their wrists and to the front, and so they absorb the sound. So the sound that you'll get when you go into the exhibition will be
immersive,
completely immersive, but a kinetic map.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting.
I'm thinking about this now.
the other question I was going to end with was Michael Hersrud, and he was asked
Hi,
specifically
Michael.
to comment on he saying noting the importance of sound. Could you comment more on the sound aspect of your research and the difficulties? You know, so you kind of anticipated that question, I think.
Hi, Michael. Yeah, another sound person.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, so Guillaume Rousser, who's a sound artist, and he has been recording sound in the desert and actually within the city over years now. So he's almost got like a time capsule of the change, you know, like how the city sounds have changed over time. And he speaks of, I mean, I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I mean, I've been working with him for about 3 years now, and you know, like, yeah, I mean, the sounds of the ecosystem in each area for him is immediately recognizable from, you know, north to south and things like that. So yes, I mean, with his expertise, we have become a little bit more interested in the audio context of all of this.
yeah, and I mean, I think that actually the audio side of this project is so incredibly beautifully linked with Dr. Aspa. So we have Dr. Aspa as this extraordinary expert of the desert in regards to the ecosystem and the flora and the fauna. And then working with the two of them within the lab, you know, we have become incredibly attuned, but not quite to the level of like a deep listener like Guillaume. And then we're not observing to the level that Dr. Aspa sees, but by fusing these things together, we're beginning to understand in a very different way the environment. And now we just need to name everything. And you know, multilingual book will come out of this.
Okay, we are definitely at time. So thank you. Wonderful experience to hear about your work. So I would ask just real quickly, this is the first lecture in a series of lectures. So just to let you know, those of you in the audience, that on Tuesday, March 14th, our next lecture will be Karen Kopriansky for VCU Arts Theater. And her title of her talk is Accents Speak Louder Than Words, Examining Accent Bias Through the Lens of Actor Training. So that sounds exciting. Okay, thanks, and we will bid you good night, and we'll get back to our day.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.